So picking up where we left off, markets were not happy today, especially with that auction of the 20-year bond. Yield on the 20-year went over 5%, 5% being the negative number that drives everyone nuts and drove the markets down. Dow lost 816 points. It was off 1.9%. S&P 500 lost 95 points. It was down 1.6%. And then the NASDAQ, the composite, was down 270 points. It lost 1.4%. So a lot of people are asking, what do I do in this kind of volatility, especially one, if you're approaching retirement, or if you are young enough to want to be saving via equities, because that's what your 401ks are requiring. What's going to happen if we keep having these kinds of big drops, and if the market volatility is foreboding and indicating that something even more negative is coming our way? I want to bring back into the stream a guest who joined us several weeks ago, but who understands retirement issues best. And I'm not talking about just for the people about to retire. I'm talking about for everybody working 20 years on up to 70. This is the man who understands what we all face. So that's why we invited David Montgomery. He is the Managing Director, Retirement Plan Services for Concurrent. David, it's good to see you again.
Great to see you again too, Adam. Thank you.
So when you see a drop like we had today, how do you, and I realize one day does not the future make, but how do you, the volatility over the last roughly 6 months, what is this saying about retirement planning going forward? And then we're going to jump into Social Security.
You know, that's a really great question. And we get this sort of discussion occurring on a regular basis, particularly when there's short bouts of volatility, say a week, a couple weeks or so, and the market tends to freak out a little bit. But then, especially when it extends about, say, 6 months or so. And typically the best situation to approach it is really bringing things back to the basics of long-term planning and long-term investing. When you look at the history of the market, we've seen these kinds of ups and downs for short periods, for long periods. And when you look at the numbers, it's staggering to see how when investors make maybe short-term moves based on some short-term volatility, they tend to be out of the market on key days. Typical phrase you hear a lot is until I feel comfortable getting back into the market. And unfortunately, when people feel comfortable is usually once the market has come back to where they were and even above. And then they're thus doing a never-ending cycle of buying things that are expensive or high and selling out when they've already gone down. So we typically suggest to keep that long-term view, even in retirement. So even as a quick example, sometimes folks might believe that they should be in all cash or something extremely conservative the day they hit retirement. But when you look at it, if you say, for example, retirement is age 65, a lot of people will live 10, 15, 20, maybe even 30 years in retirement where they need their money to last. So they definitely need some something that can add some upside to it. My grandmother, for example, is going to be 102.
Wow.
August. Yeah. so you got to plan for things like that.
Yeah. My dad's going to be 93. So yes, planning is key there. And we could talk about the 4% withdrawal on your investments, leaving them in some in equities as we go forward. But I want to talk about Social Security. A lot going on right now. And we set up with the bond route. And I realize the 20-year is something that people don't really pay attention to until you can't sell it. And the reason I bring it up is because Social Security is one of the issues that gets batted back and forth in Congress. And there's this vote on the reconciliation bill that's going to be coming up. But at the end of the day, because it gets very complicated, but the issue is U.S. government debt. And how are we going to cover future payments regarding Social Security? And in the first part of the stream, I pointed out that when people say Social Security is bankrupt, that's just not true. Right. On its current trajectory, the trustees have told us that it's not going to pay 100 cents on the dollar, but it's not bankrupt. So in a worst case scenario, on the last trustees report, 2024, it would pay 83 cents on the dollar. Now, that's not good, but it ain't bankrupt. So let's talk about Social Security. It'll be there. It's going to be there for a lot of Americans, and hopefully Congress will get its act together and fix this. How do you determine the age to take it? Because you can 62 or 70.
You get a dartboard and you throw a dart at it. No, sometimes it feels like that, actually. You know, when to take Social Security can be sometimes a very simple decision. or it can be really complicated, depending on your personal situation. It's probably one of the most personalized decisions in retirement planning and income planning in retirement. And so, when to take it, there are so many factors. Some of the key things that people tend to look at and tend to influence when someone takes Social Security, it can be very basic, either kind of a barbell effect. Sometimes it can be, okay, I've got so much money saved that I literally don't need any of Social Security, and I'm going to leave it there and get that extra boost of 8% per year. And once I can, from full retirement until age 70. Or the other end of the spectrum is someone maybe doesn't have a job and they absolutely need every penny of that Social Security as soon as possible. And then there's a whole lot in between, which is where a lot of people land. So when to take Social Security, the one of the best things that honestly can be done is at least reading up a little bit on Social Security and some of the factors that are involved with it. It's different factors from maybe an individual. They might be single, so they're just looking at their own circumstances, or a married couple. Then there's other factors of, okay, if you're a married couple, did did both spouses pour into Social Security long enough to get the full benefits? And there's a big waterfall of other factors to consider, because it can be so complicated, and because you really can significantly increase your Social Security payment if you can get the strategy just right, and if you can hold off for a certain amount of time. It really can be beneficial to have some assistance from a system or a tool or
Yeah,
advisor.
but I want to also point out, though, a lot of people, for instance, I'm going to use myself, forgive me, I am a little bit of a narcissist, or self-centered. Narcissist, not true. But look, I was on TV. You can't be on TV and not be self-centered. I set up our retirement based on pushing out Social Security to the max, if God willing, I live that long. But here's the deal. I don't know what Congress is about to do. So if I were setting this up again and I was talking to someone in their 30s and 40s, I got to imagine they're thinking, how do I plan for retirement? Because I don't know what Congress is going to do. What they're going to send my way may not be what I'm expecting now. So why make plans with Social Security as part of it, since that might be a diminished return? And we should point out to our guests, David Montgomery helps companies set up retirement plans. So he understands this stuff. So what do you say to that 30 or 40-year-old?
Yeah. So what I would say to them is for them to really look inward at their risk. They're not risk tolerance, like a risk questionnaire or something along those lines, but how much do they want to depend on Social Security being there at the current rates?
Mm-hmm.
They are banking on the money being there at the current rates. That might be pretty risky. So probably the safest bet would be to not consider it to be there and save as much as they can. And if Social Security is there, great, that's icing on the cake, and they've got a better lifestyle in retirement. The other end of the spectrum is if they, again, bank on as much as possible in Social Security, and they save the minimal amount to get to retirement income that will include that full Social Security benefit. So I'd say probably go in between.
Yeah, David, you're helping me set up. I'm just going to tease for the audience that we have a guest coming on after you, Carol Roth, because the U.S. government. Carol's going to help me go to town on, there's a Yiddish word which I love to use, fakakta. What kind of fakakta planning is that? You know it because you live in Tampa. But look, it means what it sounds like. Carol's going to be joining us in about 8 minutes. But getting back to your specialty. So I am a believer, because I've lived it, in the long-term investing in equities. But then you get a day like we had today, driven by the bond issue, which is tied to the U.S. government debt issue, which Social Security, even though it's funded through our payroll taxes, is a whole other issue. How do you plan, if you're going to use your 401k for that investing, in this kind of volatility, especially since the 401k was never intended to be your sole retirement income?
Yeah, so there's a variety of methods to go about it for planning for days like this. A very simple, easy one. Let me back up for a second. So if you're someone in your 20s and 30s, you're going to weather this storm. You're not going to need this money for retirement for decades. So no big deal. don't look at your statement, just move on to kind of keep it short. And if anything, when you see downturns, that's an opportunity to buy things more on sale. If someone is coming up to or in retirement, that's where days like this are much scarier and much more potentially impactful, because they could be taking withdrawals on a down day where their portfolio has really decreased. In the 2008 recession, I literally spoke to people that looked for assistance a little too late and were crying, like literally crying their eyes out because their portfolios went down 40% and they were supposed to retire and they couldn't do anything about it then because they couldn't wait it out. So getting very practical on days like this, if someone is in that area where they don't have the time to weather the storm, that's where a variety of methods, there's bucketing, there's other different ways to do it. But a key way would be in that overall planning, have part of your portfolio for that longer term time. And when you're needing to actually take withdrawals from your accounts, possibly have that aside where it's not going to be impacted by these ups and downs.
You know, I interviewed Ted Benna, who was the man who is the father of the 401k, discovered the tax benefits back in 1978 because they had changed the code, and
Yeah.
it's line 401k of the tax code in 78.
Right.
That's where it comes from. He said the greatest thing about the 401k program, and he doesn't think it's a good sole retirement thing, but he said it's a savings plan. And to me, is it still, if your company matches, it's the best, you know, for every dollar you put in, if you get, let's say, 2 or 3%, that's 2 or 3% you didn't have, and you don't have to worry about volatility. Is that still the biggest reason to do the 401k, and if you can, max it?
Oh, absolutely. That is free money right there. I mean, let's use an example that a lot of employers do: dollar for dollar match. You put in a dollar, they put in a dollar. You put in $1,000, they put in $1,000. If you look at it as in terms of returns, if it was a return, that's 100% return. Most people would love to look at their statement and say, "Ooh, I got an instant 100% return." Now, it's obviously not returns, but on that certain money, there is that exact match, whether it's dollar for dollar, 50 cents on the dollar, or whatever that formula is. But at minimum, saving, if you don't go over the match that a company gives you, at least going to that what that match is, because that's free money right there.
Well, from your, I'm going to ask you the personal question. Don't
Sure.
give away your age. But what keeps you awake at night when you think about your own retirement planning?
Ooh, you know what? It's what I believe most people struggle with, and that is all the things pulling at our finances. No matter how wealthy or the opposite someone is, everybody has pulls at their finances and what they might want to or need to spend it on. So that's a big thing is balancing the saving for retirement, the college savings, the general budget and eating necessities to the toys that we want.
Yeah.
So that's
Not $30, only $1 now.
right. Just $1 this time.
Right. Well,
Exactly.
but let me ask you this, because you design the plans that a lot of us in the corporate world who have access to 401ks, you help companies design the plans to best serve their employees. Are we going to see changes to these plans? What's coming at us because of the volatility or just because of other things?
You know, typically because of volatility in the retirement plan space, you don't see many changes to the investments in the plan, because most employers have that long-term view. A lot of times, they'll have an official process that they need to follow according to ERISA, which is the law that governs 401k plans. You really need to have a documented process for selecting and monitoring the investments. And with that, many times they'll look at investments and put it on something called a watch list
Hmm.
and keep it on there for sometimes 3 or 4 quarters or so before removing it, because funds do go in those ups and downs and tend to weather storms, and they look at the long-term view. Now, what could happen more likely is if there is an extended economic downturn and the company goes into some financial difficulties. Well, that's where the company matches are usually the first thing to be reduced or go completely. In 2008, we had, if the company didn't go under, then that was one of the very first things they said: "I'm sorry, guys, you've got a job, but no match, a company match. Which would you rather have?" So they said the job, clearly.
All right. And I would just want to let everyone know Carol Roth is on standby. She's coming in just 2 minutes. So make sure you get your questions in X. on Twitter for Carol, because we're going to be talking about all kinds of things. But David, I interviewed Sam Stovall just the other day from CFRA, and I talked to him about my own personal fears, which are plenty. I live in New York City, but what I asked him was, look, is the United States still the place for investors? Because you hear about all of this outflow from equities to foreign markets, because that's right now where the return is. He said it will always be the United States. These are cyclical. It's going to come back. Of course, you can't time it. So what do you say about, I know you can't time a market, but who's sleeping well at night and who is not sleeping well at night? And what would you say to Sam?
Those that are sleeping well at night are those that are doing a couple of things. One, they've actually got a plan in place, a long-term plan, and one that they can rely on, that it's not just a flippant, plan. Another one is typically those that are actually having help. So a very good example by some kind of a professional, whether it's a system or an individual, great example is in the downturn in 2020 when COVID happened. Massive downturn very, very quickly, 34, 35%. When looking at the 401k environment, there were a lot of trades that happened at that time because obvious reasons, market plummeted, COVID was happening. The individuals that made the most knee-jerk reaction and thus most likely were not sleeping well at night were those trying to do this on their own. With the asset allocation and the overall plan. Second least amount of trades were those that were in the retirement plan and they had something where they had their money in something called a target date fund, where their mix of investments is automatically done for them and curated to a risk volatility according to roughly the year they were going to retire or turn age 65. And then those that did the least amount of knee-jerk reactions were those that in something called an advisor managed account, which is a very efficient way through technology and about 7 to 14 data points pulled from payroll and other sources that customized an asset allocation specific to an individual's circumstance, and also had an individual that they could speak with when they, if they had any fears of what's going on. Some numbers, if I remember specifically, those that were in the advisor managed accounts, 0.3% of people actually made a change in their portfolio. So very, very small. Those that were in the target date funds, which was help, but not totally personalized, it was, I believe, 2.3% of people in 401k plans. And those that were going on their own, I don't recall the exact number, but it was definitely significantly higher than both of those. And so that makes the case for those that are sleeping at night are those that are usually having assistance from a financial professional in some fashion, and those that actually have a plan that they can rely on.
David Montgomery, first, thank you for sticking with us. We had a technical at the beginning, and I feel like I got shortchanged because I didn't get to talk to you as much as I wanted to. But if you have questions, if you're a business owner and you want to set up a retirement plan, David Montgomery is the person to call. He is Retirement Plan Services Managing Director for Concurrent. You can find him on LinkedIn. That's the easiest way to find him. And by the way, David, if you ever decide to give up this financial thing, you have got the pipes for your own podcast and radio. You should pursue it. You should go for it.
Thank you very much, Adam. I really appreciate it.
It was great to see you, David. Thank you so much.
Great
so we were just talking about Social Security and what's going to happen there. And by the way, as we've been talking, I believe that the Freedom Caucus has announced they're on board with the big, beautiful tax bill, the reconciliation bill. So get ready, because there's going to be a whole lot of bond freaking out coming up should the House pass it, and then we'll see what the Senate does. But this is a great way for me to set up our next guest, who, by the way, this is kind of a reunion for us, because Carol Roth and I met many years ago, many sunsets ago. But you know her much better than you know me. Carol Roth is the author of the New York Times bestseller, You Will Own Nothing, Your War with a New Financial World Order and How to Fight Back. She is also, I love the self-deprecating humor, but you describe yourself as a recovering investment banker. And just, I'll remind people at the end of this, but if you want to follow Carol Roth, you can sign up for her economic newsletter at carolroth.com/ I always say backslash, I always get it wrong, but carolroth.com news. And just lastly, you've got 100,000 plus followers. If those people are watching, feel free to send in your questions for Carol right here on Twitter because we will make sure she gets them. But Carol, after that long-winded of me rambling, it's good to see you again.
It's good. And I'm glad that you didn't say that we were old friends. I'm going to say we're longtime friends because we're not old. We've just known each other for a
Yes,
long time, Adam.
we're mature. How is that? And I'm
Mature
still
friends.
my questions about Social Security and investing for retirement are self-centered because I think about that a lot more than I did when I was 30 or when I was 40. Because that day is coming at me much faster, and the pickup truck that's going to run me over is speeding up. But so let me just ask you real quick, Carol. When you saw what happened with the bond route today, you understand this stuff much better than a lot of us. What did you think?
I mean, I've been waiting for it. I wondered what took them so long, and we've had sort of the ups and downs. But the first thing that I said was the bond market is a honey badger. If you remember, the old honey badger doesn't give a you know what,
Mm-hmm.
and the bond market is going to do what the bond market is going to do. And so, for all the people who keep calling for the Fed to cut rates, I keep trying to explain that we are in a period of what's called fiscal dominance, where fiscal policy is basically dominating monetary policy. And we can get into the whys of all of that. But we are up almost 100 basis points from where we were when the Fed decided to first cut rates.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that the Fed has really lost the long end of the curve, and we're getting into, I think you mentioned that red, kind of red zone. I think when we get to 4.8 on the 10-year, you start really getting everybody perked up. If it goes to 5, I would imagine we're going to see some intervention. But it really just speaks to our broken fiscal foundation and the fact that we don't have a lot of options, and we're not getting a lot of help from Congress right now.
Well, yeah, but there's that. But there's also the Japanese. I don't want to get into the Japanese bond route over there, but that was the first. Hey, everybody, this skunk hole's starting to stink. Government debt is catching up with us, and yet we're nowhere near that metric, that debt ratio that the Japanese are. So why in the United States would people be freaking out? Because I'll bet you we hit that 5% in the 10-year, and I bet you we hit it pretty soon.
Yeah, well, Japan is its own weird entity. They always say there are advanced economies, there are emerging economies, and then there's Argentina and Japan. And it's got a weird dynamic where, they have a high savings rates that kind of changes the dynamic. But for us as the, holder of the currency that has been the world's reserve currency and trading currency, we've gotten a little bit of flexibility. I mean, if you look at our debt to GDP,
Mm-hmm.
we basically have the equivalent of an emerging market balance sheet. I mean, we would have a sovereign debt crisis if it were not the fact that the dollar was used, so frequently in trade and still is a substantial portion of reserves. But what's interesting, over the last 10 plus years is central banks have actually been net sellers of treasuries. I'm not sure people really understand that. And they have not been replacing the dollars with another currency. They've been replacing that on their balance sheet with gold, which is why we've seen, gold kind of go through the roof here. But what that means is what we're left with are the price sensitive buyers, right? Central banks in terms of treasuries are not particularly price sensitive. And now we're seeing the term premium, the premium that investors are demanding for holding the securities for longer. We're seeing that start to rise. And I think that, that's going to continue to play into the dynamic.
And in a second, we're going to take a step back. I want to ask you about the book. But when I interviewed Sam Stovall and then a discussion with some of my colleagues at my other job at the Pizza Hut, they were talking about the fact that despite the quantitative easing and the alleged trying to get down the balance sheet, that the Fed is actually buying quietly U.S. Treasuries. And when I heard that, and I'm not an economist, but it worried me because it's not something they're talking about publicly. But if they're doing that, what is it they're trying to do? And will they have to pick it up and do more of that given what we're witnessing to get interest rates down?
Yeah, I think the likelihood of what happens is that there's some percentage, and we can call it 5, but maybe it's a little less than a little bit more, that when the 10-year hits, the entire market is going to kind of puke on itself. And I think there's going to be some form of intervention. And puke on itself is the technical term, by the way. And I think that the Fed, with their QT that's not QT, whatever it is that they're doing, QT that's QE, it's a what's kind of a not quite yield curve control, but not really not yield curve control. You also have the Treasury, who's been doing buybacks too. And so
Hmm.
I think you're going to see more intervention, whatever they call it. But yield curve control is like a QE, except for it's unlimited, right? It's whatever amount is required to get interest rates into a certain area that everybody's comfortable with. And given the amount of debt that we have to finance and refinance this year, it's not at the levels that we have today, or we end up in this crazy debt spiral where interest expands the deficit, which means we have to finance more, which means yields go up, and we end up in an ugly spiral. So I do think we're going to see more intervention, and it can come in lots of different flavors. They're very creative, but the release valve on the other side of that is inflation. And I think that is what you're seeing, in the market, the part of the market that's super smart and kind of, senses what's going on. Whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's gold, whether it's, in the bond market, that there's an understanding that there aren't a lot of options here. And that means that we're probably going to see a return to inflation again, not getting a lot of help from Congress in terms of cutting spending to reduce the deficit, to cut down on the chances of a debt spiral or something like that.
I used the term fakakta earlier in the stream. I'm going to say
I appreciate
at
that.
this point.
Yeah.
I measure inflation. I call it my Talenti metric, because I can get Talenti gelato for $5.99 at one supermarket, but at the one across the street from us, I have to actually walk further to get it. It's $9.99, and I don't know why any New Yorker, as crazy as the city is, would pay $9.99 for this stuff when you can get it 10 blocks away for $5.99. Let me talk to you about the book. You Will Own Nothing: Your War with a New Financial World Order and How to Fight Back. I've not read the book, but I want to ask you a question, because I had a guest on who a long time ago pointed out that the genius of Elon Musk is that no one will own a car, they'll have to lease it. It's kind of this perpetual cycle of payments for everything. Is that the issue that you're hitting upon in You Will Own Nothing, or is it even worse than that?
So it's actually a combination of a whole slew of different things, and technology renting our lives back to us as a subscription or a service is certainly a piece of that. It's also Wall Street going in and buying up all the homes and renting it back. It's
Mm-hmm.
also the Fed printing money and making it harder for people to save, and to, kind of creating more non-merit based inequality. And so it's basically all these different things that are happening, just as we are on this precipice of the financial world order changing. All the things that we're talking about, the fact that, we're kind of losing control of our position as the center of the financial world, which has been completely self-inflicted, and all the things that kind of go along with that. And so, I wanted to give people some thoughts about, all these different, kind of interferences to wealth creation, because you know as well as I do that wealth creation comes from owning things, and people
Mm-hmm.
who haven't owned things in history have not been wealthy, and in many cases have not been particularly happy. So really talking through all the different areas that are coming at people, and then giving a prescription to fight back.
My colleagues used to fight over who got to go to Davos for the World Economic Forum, and I used to say, good riddance, go for it. I mean, nothing better than noblesse oblige, the very wealthy flying in their private jets to complain about climate change. But did the inspiration for this come from things you witnessed among the wealthiest among us at Davos?
Well, so I have never been to Davos. I'm not a fan of the World Economic Forum
You
and
score
all of
points for
those
that.
elitists, but that is where the title came from, right? And it's their famous video, their 8 predictions for 2030, and their number one was "You will own nothing, and you'll be happy." And I just thought that that was so funny, and the language is so interesting, because it's always "you will own nothing." It's not "we will own nothing." Like, we're going to be great, but you will own nothing. And I thought that was the perfect encapsulation of these very elite who are trying to jockey for control as the system is changing, and make sure that they have, their wealth and their property rights secured at the expense of, everyone else, the middle class, the American dream. And so that wasn't the starting point, but when I started taking all these different points together, it really just hit me that that saying was the perfect encapsulation to kind of move forward with.
So how does someone fight back?
You got to do exactly the opposite, right? You got to do what they are doing instead of what they're saying. Everybody who's telling you not to own things are doubling down on owning things. They're owning farmland, they're owning gold, they're owning homes, they're owning stocks. They're doing everything that it is that they say not to do. And so, I know people like to spend and like their experiences and like to live a light life. And I'm not saying spend on stuff. I'm saying invest in things that have the opportunity to hold its value. Because as we talk about, if we are going to see a return to inflation, we're likely going to see asset inflation as well as cost of living inflation. And you want to make sure that you're keeping up with that. So own. That's my takeaway
Hey,
there.
listen, I know that a lot of your fans, and you've got, six-figure following on just Twitter. So if you're watching and you want to ask Carol a question, put your question into the Twitter feed. We will make sure she gets it. Yeah, there you go. We've got thousands watching right now, thanks to you. So I owe you next time you're in New York City. But let me ask you this. And last week, I joked about this at the top of the stream. I do this thing now where I get to, I used to call it pontificating and rambling, but I try to hear the facts, very sensible. We have a socialist who's going to run for mayor in New York City, and I think he's going to win for all kinds of reasons we don't have to get into. But he has an idea, which personally I think is a good one, free public transportation, why I think it's a good idea, you can pay for it. And there's no way to pay for it. You just can't. So I would table it till you can figure out a way to pay for it. When you look at the federal government, when did we lose the understanding of, look, it's okay to leverage going forward, but when did we get out of control with it? Because now the bill is coming due.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people would point to us going off the gold standard. It's the thing that opened the floodgates for that to happen. When you move from a backed currency to a fiat currency, it creates all kinds of moral hazard. I think that in terms of our lifetimes, where we've really saw the shift was probably during the Great Recession financial crisis, the enabling of that and the response to that, and this idea that somehow we shouldn't let ourselves go through these recessions, that we should print to prop up the stock market, that we shouldn't, kind of go through the natural cycles, that we should disrupt risk, and we should basically, give money to the asset holders at the expense of the savers and the retirees. I mean, that really opened that door for that non-merit driven inequality. I don't mind inequality that's merit based, right? If Michael Jordan, Beyonce, they should get paid a lot of money because they're great
Amen.
at what they do. But when it's the government and government, related entities that are tipping the scales, I have a huge problem with that. And unfortunately, most people can't put their finger on that, right? They want to blame capitalism or they want to blame something else. And they don't understand that this has been based on government, fiscal and monetary policy that has really driven the shift.
I was in DC during the financial crisis, covered all that. That's when you and I started talking when I was at Fox. But the thing that upsets me about where we are now is that, I have enjoyed a 20-year trajectory of growth in investments, and it feels as if it was because of the artificially low interest rates.
Absolutely.
That it's not real. And now what I'm worried about, because my timeline to recover from that is shorter. Hopefully I'll live as long as my folks. But if we correct this, then won't I and millions of Americans who are Gen X lose out?
Well, as I said, I think that the path forward, there's a very narrow path forward to correct this. And I think the only palatable way to correct it is probably going to be through inflation. So the fact that you are an asset holder means, maybe not on a real basis, but on a nominal basis, you'll be at least kind of keeping pace with what is going on. It's going to be really hard for those younger people who haven't had the opportunity to accumulate assets. And we're seeing that already, right? We're seeing that with the fact that they can't get into houses, and a lot of young people don't think that they'll ever live the American dream. So I think the likely outcome is just more of a divide, which we know is not a good thing for a country, creates all kinds of civil unrest. And it's a very difficult thing to plot our way out of. I think most likely there is certainly a scenario where they just let everything fall apart. And if that's the case, that's really ugly, and we could have a whole different conversation about that.
Yeah,
But I
right.
think the politically, realistic way is that most people, they'll see everything going up, but they won't understand that their purchasing power has been diminished.
Um, what worries me is I do believe that we live in the greatest country on the planet. I think that the United States provides all of us the ability, especially with the changes that our democracy and our republic have made since you and I first came on the scene in the 60s and 70s. But the opportunity that exists when I hear younger people who understandably have a right to be angry about the plate they're being served, I then hear them talking about calling for the destruction of Western civilization in the United States. And I'm saying, what? That just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, look, we have hard choices to make with the government and with our spending and what we're going to do in the future, but we can do those together. Destroying it doesn't seem to me to be a rational option. I mean, are you encountering that in your part of the country?
Yeah, I mean, envy is a hell of a drug. And I think that unfortunately has been part of the far left agenda, the Bernie Sanders and AOC wing of the Democratic Party, where, they go on their oligarchy tour on their private jets, by
Yes.
the way. Bernie Sanders with his 3 homes to tell you how bad capitalism is and, how awful things are and how everything needs to be destroyed. And we do need major renovation here. There are a lot of things that are broken, but and it's sorry for being PC, but you know me. We're the skinniest kid at fat camp, so
Mhm.
we're not great. But look at everybody else in the world, and there
Right.
isn't like, oh, here's this other bastion of freedom and choice and capitalism and property rights that we're going to end up. We could just go there and basically go back to the early American experiment. So we have the best foundation, even with all of its problems, to fix and
Mhm.
rebuild and remodel. And I think that needs to be the discussion. But it is too easy to point out the envy and to point out these disparities, which, frankly, were not fair, but that's where we are today. And, to say, oh, it needs to be torn down, because a lot of the people who are listening to it really don't have the experience outside of this regime and scenario.
Yeah, I got a flash alert just as we were coming into the stream that it looks as if the reconciliation bill, the spending bill, is going to get, passed. My question is, if the making the tax cuts permanent and some of the other things that are going to happen is going to drive up our debt,
Yep.
I'm not sure what you cut, because you and I both know Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid account for a large portion of
Yep.
U.S. government spending, and none of us want to cut defense spending, which is now going to be over $1 trillion. What do you do?
So, I mean, there needs to be some really strong choreography. And I think that Scott Bessent, his plan was, let's take our deficit that's, running 6 to 7%, wartime level deficit, about double kind of what it's been historically as a percentage of GDP. And let's try and get that down to 3. Like that would be a big home run. And where you'd start, I think, is you'd start with what Elon Musk was uncovering in terms of Doge. That's the low hanging fruit, the waste, fraud, and abuse. Yes, we spend a lot on Social Security and Medicare, but what percentage of that is fraudulent? Yes, we spend a lot on defense spending, but certainly there's some waste in there that we can get rid of. And then across the board, there's all kinds of places. So I think that in each bucket, you can go in and be surgical and get rid of what isn't necessary. That's what you would do, right, if you were running a company.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can go in after you kind of write that and have that, very careful choreography and order of operations to
Mm-hmm.
coming up with a longer term plan to fix Social Security and Medicare. But the idea that there's not all, $1 trillion or more of waste. And I think they'll probably find some unpalatable way to maybe get interest expense down that's going to cause some inflation. But again, I don't think we're going to have a choice here.
I want to start wrapping up. I am curious. You just brought up Social Security. You understand money much better than most of us, and finance, and also long-term finance.
Yes.
Any thoughts on how I use the metrics regarding Social Security that the trustees are saying, 83 cents on the dollar if we don't do anything. So not bankrupt, but it's not what we're promising retirees. And 1 in 5 Americans receive Social Security. It's 55 million old age retirees. If you add in disability and all of it, it's like 78 million. How would you fix this?
Well, first of all, you and I differ a little bit. I personally think it's the second cousin of a Ponzi scheme. You do not get paid unless somebody else paid in. There is nothing sitting in that trust other than a quote unquote IOU. And who finances the IOU? Oh, by the way, we do, and we do it with debt. So there's nothing in there. We're just hoping that people continue to work and continue to pay in so that you get your payout. Ultimately, over time, if it really was our money, it would be in individual accounts, right? I would own it. I would know what the account is. I could pass that on to my heirs. It would be very, very clear. And that would have been a really smart thing to do, but we're far away from that. So I think that you need to come up with something that stages in, right? Where you start with the people who, are in retirement, are getting Social Security, you're not taking away their benefits. But as you kind of go down, you have to change the parameters of the time for retirement and how much they're getting, and maybe the ideal option is you means test it and you get people to opt out of it, but you can only do that, and people are only agreeing to that if you put some reins on Congress to say that if I'm going to do this, you have to give up something too, and you have to be fiscally responsible, because nobody wants to make a change if there isn't going to be the commensurate change from Congress long term. And I think that's what makes this virtually impossible, is that if you get Social Security in a good place, if you're able to cut that spending, Congress is just going to come back and change it and just spend somewhere else. So I think we need to figure out how we can get a hold of Congress and kind of hold them to a more constitutional approach to spending before we can even talk about, because I do think, there are people like me, I would opt out. I'd be fine if that meant that I could get some other things on the other side. And I just don't believe that we could do that. So I think that's the conversation, and it's going to be a hard one to have because politicians going to politician.
Yes. This is what you and I agree on many things on Social Security. You and I disagree on some things, because I think, I'm going to talk about this in just a second, but I do think we need to, and I heard you say this, preserve Social Security, but then gradually step down, giving younger people a chance to get out and take control of their own retirement future. And I just don't have the brain power to figure out how you do that. I don't think Congress has the brain power to figure out how to do that either.
Well, I think you would do something along the lines of that. Maybe you keep the amount that you pay in, but the employer match goes to kind of the pot for the people who aren't paying it. And there's a way to model it out. But again, nobody's going to do this until we get some assurances that Congress isn't just going to screw us over in a different way.
Want to bet? All right, so let me let you have the last word before I thank you. And it's a real pleasure to reconnect. The newsletter again at carolroth.com. Make sure that you check this out. Congratulations on the success of The Following speaks for itself, but on the books as well. Are you working on a new book? Is there another one coming out?
So I had a historical fiction book that I'd been working on that's like a whole other thing that may or may not ever come out, but not another nonfiction book right now. There have been a few things I've toyed with, and there just hasn't been anything that's grabbed me enough to say I'm going to do it. Or things are moving so quickly that my other fear is, because it takes a long time to get a book to market, that by the time I write it, that it's going to be obsolete. And that's, whether we're talking about AI or we're talking about our financial situation, things are moving really rapidly right now. So you have to kind of time it and be thinking a year ahead, which You Will Own Nothing was perfect. And I did that, but that's not an easy thing to do. And it's certainly not an easy thing to do right now.
I will tell you, you just brought up AI, and I'm working in AI now. I left the media world before it kicked me to the curb, as it's doing to all of my friends and colleagues. But it is fascinating what the company I'm working for has developed, and I watch the different iterations of things that are happening. You can have augmented or automatic, or it can be with human hybrid. But right. It is fascinating, and my friends who are lawyers, I'll say it will never replace lawyers, and I'm like, already has. I don't, and it is then friends who are saying they're telling the kids to become plumbers and electricians. Well, guess what? They're creating the robots that might be able to do that. Now, next year, no. The year after, no. But 5 years, 10 years, here it comes.
Yeah. I'm just waiting for AI to replace Congress. Then we'll be in a good space.
That's going to be the social media meme. I'm just waiting for AI to replace Congress. Last thought. What do you want to leave people with?
Listen, things are changing rapidly with our fiscal foundation. Protect yourself. You're not going to be able to control the macro, but you can control the micro. So do the best you can in terms of your behaviors. I know personal austerity is not particularly fun, but if you could maybe forego that trip, or that kind of extra experience, and put that money into investments and have that diversified portfolio, it's going to create less stress for you. It's going to take away some of that stress over your lifetime. So go out and own lots of things.
And maybe one day we can talk about compound interest and why it is the miracle for so many people when you're investing in equities. It is a pleasure to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us, Carol Roth. All the best to you.
Same to you. Thanks for having me.
So I started the stream by throwing out the question. The magic question is, why is the figure 176,100 a magical number? Well, as you know from talking about Social Security during the stream, what I'm talking about is the cap. For people in the United States who make $176,100.01, once you make over 176,100, that's the cap, you no longer pay Social Security taxes. And your employer no longer pays on your income. So everything above that cap, it's yours. It's like getting a 6% raise if you're making that. 25% of the households in the United States, roughly 25%, earn income above that. Now that we're talking households, so that could be husband and wife. But the bottom line is, let's say that cap is 25%. In this discussion about how do we secure Social Security, again, 83 cents on the dollar, not bankrupt, but 83 cents on the dollar if we don't do anything. And the Social Security trustees have said this is coming at us, and it's coming at us fast. 2033, that is what, 7-8 years away? So Congress has to do something. Now, you just heard Carol suggest one alternative to this, which was gradually let people opt out while preserving the benefits for those who are retired and those who are getting close to it. That is one option, and means testing is one of those options. The other option is something that has positives and negatives, and that's removing the cap, eliminating the cap altogether. Now think about that. 25% of households in the United States make over $176,100 a year. According to the trustees, if you remove the Social Security cap, you don't eliminate the funding shortfall, but you diminish it anywhere from 50 to 75%, and you push out the, I'll call it the come to Jesus moment, the real reckoning, anywhere from 2050 to possibly even 75 years. So that's one incentive to perhaps do that. But there is a consequence. What happens to the 3.5 million small business owners in the country who then have to start paying the Social Security tax? So here is my thought on this. If we remove or eliminate the Social Security cap, maybe we put in a window. Because look, if you're raising a family and you're making $176,000, $177,000, God bless you. But in parts of this country, that money does not go as far as it would years ago. So maybe we create a window. We eliminate the cap for everyone over 176 for going forward, but then we keep it in place for people 176 to 400,000, and then eliminate it for everyone above 400,000. Maybe that's one way to do it. Maybe we create some kind of incentive for small business owners if we eliminate the cap, that they don't have to continue paying. Because the downside, if you make the small business owners pay, is they may not be able to invest. They may not be able to hire. There's a way to do it. Sure, we would not raise, according to the trustees, the $1 trillion over 10 years that eliminating the cap once and for all across the board would raise, but it would raise some funds. And let's ask this question. People making over $400,000 or $500,000 a year, would eliminating the cap for them while securing small businesses, would that really hurt them, or would that really cost them consequence? Now, I get it. It's their money. This is the kind of discussion that the leaders in Congress need to have. And these are the kinds of hard choices we as Americans have to make. If the majority of Americans were against it, they could vote the members of Congress who might support that out. But a Pew Research study found that 79% of us, 79% of Americans, think that there should be no change whatsoever in benefits for Social Security recipients. So there it is. We got to figure out a way to fund this and close that gap, or else people are going to have to take a cut in their benefits. And one way to do that is to eliminate the Social Security tax cap, the payroll tax cap, maybe build in windows so that people don't get penalized for it, maybe build in windows so that small business owners don't get the burden of having to carry this. But we have to do something. And right there on the table, the numbers are laid out for us from the CBO as well as Social Security trustees. There's an option available. Do the leaders in Congress have the guts to do it? I doubt it. We'll see you next week.